Hello and thank you for joining us today. I will be regaling you about my Draconic language. That is how the name of our language is pronounced in our language. It literally means the words of us dragons, or the language of us dragons. So I have a number of facets of this topic that I wish to discuss with all of you. Starting out, I wanted to share the process by which I even was able to begin rediscovering this language. It took me a while to even consciously realize that my species did not speak English, which might sound a little silly now, looking back, but essentially the nature of my dragon kinness is that my memories of my dragon life have all been translated into English. And so when I think back on interactions that I had in that life, I hear it all in my head in English. But eventually I realized that, we didn't have the mouth shape or the teeth or the tongue shape or anything really necessary to make human noises for the most part. And so that got me thinking. So what did we speak? What did we sound like? And obviously I knew that we roared, and I knew that we growled and hissed, but figuring out what our actual language sounded like took some digging and a lot of meditation and a lot of frustration. But in time I came to a bit of an epiphany that sometimes I speak it without meaning to. The first time I realized this was I was sick and had to get up off the couch, and I didn't want to, and I was tired and I wasn't feeling good, and without even thinking about it, I just started muttering to myself in Draconic. And I didn't realize it at the time. It was later thinking back on that, wait a minute. That wasn't just making a bunch of random noises. That was language. That was me muttering to myself about how unhappy I was about my situation at that moment. And I wasn't doing it in English, I was doing it in Draconic. And once I made that connection, all of a sudden I realized that all of my previous meditative attempts, I was trying too hard. And you know how it is when you try too hard, sometimes you just completely miss the obvious. And that was when I realized that despite the fact that I thought that everything that I remembered as a dragon being translated into English, the truth was simpler and more complex. I was remembering these things in my Draconic language, but somehow between the translation between my subconscious and conscious mind made it seem like it was English. And since making that realization, if I just let my mind relax and I just think about, okay, here's a word. What is it in Draconic? And unless I'm too distracted or something else is causing me to just not be able to focus well enough, I can usually come up with it. The problem ultimately comes down to I cannot make all of the noises necessary, and that's a forever problem. And that was what got me started into some of the things you're going to see hear demonstrated later on in this panel. Is I got into trying to find other sources of noises that replicate noises that my species could make. So to that end of trying to recreate this language as best I could, and in particular to the end of making this presentation as thorough and hopefully interesting as possible, I started scouring many sources for noises that made me think of noises that my species made. And I wound up using a lot of dinosaur noises from video games and the internet. Especially, there were a couple of YouTube videos that I found that had excellent recreations of T-Rex noises, what it was thought to be, what they sounded like, that happened to sound a hell of a lot like some of the noises that my species could make. And I have, at the end of this video, there will be credits that you will be able to see the sources that I got all of the noises that I used here from. So hopefully that will be helpful to anybody that wants to go hunting for their own draconic noises. So without further ado, let's get into the really rambly bits. I think a good place to start with all this is just to kind of talk a little bit about what I know of my species in general, both relating and not exactly directly relating to our spoken language. So we were, for those that haven't heard me or seen me write walls of text in the Spire or at previous summits, my species were a Western style of dragon, to use the common term. We had 4 legs and 2 wings, and you can see what I looked like, well, at least what my head looked like from my illustrations on the screen here. We were fairly feral in body type. To use, again, some common terminology that's well known, we were, however, a fully sapient species, and we had our own culture, and we had our own writing system, which I'll get into some more later. And we are an exceptionally old species. We are, by my guesstimates, because our planet had a different timescale than Earth, we had a longer orbit, and I believe also a longer rotation. So our days were longer and our years were longer. But as far as I can tell, using the units of time measurement that we're used to here, my species had been around for somewhere around 3 million years, maybe longer. And we had started out as basically animals, and our intelligence evolved over time. Our bodies are pretty much unchanged. We're kind of like sharks. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But our culture has changed massively. Back in the earliest records and in the earliest genetic memories of my species, we were brutal, savage, tribal beings that fought over anything and everything, from water sources to mates to hatchlings to I don't like the way you looked at me. Kind of sounds familiar to humanity, actually. But anyway, over time we grew past that, and we became more civilized, and at the time that I myself lived, which was, as far as I can guesstimate, about 4,000 years ago, we were a relatively advanced society. We had essentially united completely, and in a very literal sense, about 98% of our population shared the same cave network, which I suppose you could consider to be like an underground city. We called it Home Cave, or at least the word that we used for it would translate as Home Cave. And that was where pretty much the seat of our civilization was. There was a humanoid race that we shared the planet with, and we had essentially a symbiotic relationship with them. In fact, our word for them basically translates to the dragons without wings. They were one of us. They just looked different as far as we were concerned. Some other details about my species. I mentioned the writing system. Our primary, how shall I say it, our primary cultural gem was our library, where we stored history for anyone who was interested, and that was mostly dragons, but some of our humanoid brethren also used it, because we had some of their history recorded there that they had lost. We were a telepathic species, which might sound a little odd. If you were telepathic, why did you speak? And that goes back to our warlike history. It's not a good idea, and anybody else here who is a dragon who's telepathic will probably know where I'm going with this. It's not a very good idea if you're fighting with your neighbors who live less than 2 miles away to have your minds open all the time, where they could peek in and see what you're thinking to each other, where they might even try to mentally assault you. So even though we were telepathic back then, we didn't use it very much because it wasn't safe to do so. And hence the vocal language was born. One thing that I found very hard to find any recreations of online or in any sources, and the biggest problem is that most speaker systems can't reproduce it. Our species made a lot of infrasound, which that's what elephants are famous for, is they're below the human range of hearing. They're below the range of most animals' hearing. But they're these very deep, rumbling sounds that can vibrate the earth and actually can show up on seismographs. So very, very powerful vibrations. Very, very few speaker systems can reproduce them, so very, very few creators online have bothered to make anything like that. There's one recording that I'll be playing for you that hopefully everybody will actually be able to hear because it is on the very low end of the sound spectrum, and a lot of speakers, especially headphones, can't reproduce them. But they were a big part of our vocal language. We vibrated a lot. Another important thing about our language, besides the vibrations and the growly talk, is that our language is also partially visual. It wasn't a full sign language, but some of the context of our language, you had to see the other dragon to understand the complete context of what they were saying. There's a little bit of that in human speech. Anybody who, like me, is phone shy knows it's hard to talk to somebody when you can't see their face. For us, it was hard to talk to somebody when you couldn't see their wings and their tail and their face, and sometimes their paws. We mostly gesticulated with our wings and tail, but we did sometimes use our paws. And you could wind up losing a lot of context, sometimes very important context, if you couldn't see the other dragon, which, yes, made things difficult for blind dragons, and yes, we occasionally had a dragon in our midst who suffered from blindness. And there really wasn't much that we could do for them because the language was kind of set in its ways. But they very often found ways to compensate, which I think is just really cool. We didn't have very many of them, but they were some of our smartest and most empathic, actually. Probably because they had to learn other ways to read dragons. I think another important thing to bring up is technically, not only did we have our vocal language with its sort of sign language components, but we actually technically had 2 vocal languages. One of them was actually the older language that was developed probably before we were sapient, and it's a very simplistic language. It's mostly comprised of here I am, where are you friend, I am friend, or I am foe. And as a result, even though we still use it, we only use it for very important, time-sensitive communications, like come here now, it's important. And the other dragon would then respond with, okay, here I come. Because that's about the limit of that language. And it's entirely comprised of roars, and I do have a demonstration of that for you that I will play later in this presentation. But in the meantime, let's have enough of me just talking at you, and let's get into some of these sound files that I've been talking about. I'm going to open with the ones that I found from various sources, and then later I will give some demonstrations with my own vocal organs of some of our words and phrases that I've been able to recall and that I can actually speak with my poor, poor human vocal cords. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. So, I'm going to replay one of these for you with a little more context, because I think it's really a cool case of serendipity that this sound, even though it exists, it's from a video game and is, I believe, electronically produced. It just so happens to sound exactly like one of our words in my species language, and that just kind of makes me giddy with excitement whenever I think about it. So let me play it again for you, and then I'll tell you what it means. So this is essentially, it would be a piece of a phrase when used naturally, but in a vacuum it still holds the same meaning of hunting fish, specifically. So you might use it in a sentence just to tell another dragon where you're going and what you're going to be doing with your day. So moving forward, I'm going to play a few clips for you that are some of the deeper rumbling sounds that I mentioned in the introduction to this video. They're not true infrasound because I couldn't find anything, and besides that, most sound systems, as I mentioned, can't reproduce it anyway. But they will give you an idea of what our infrasound might have sounded like. So these next clips, I don't actually know if you will be able to hear them. I can hear them on my sound system, but I've got a pretty robust subwoofer. So if you hear silence, that's on me. I found some stuff that was just a little too out there for most sound systems, and I apologize in advance if that happens to you. But these are the closest I could find to our really, really rumbly rumbles. And there we are. If you heard silence, I'm sorry. If you heard the rumbles, yay! So that concludes all of the rumbly-durg noises. But we're not done. I have plenty more for you to hear. Don't worry. Alright, now I would like you to imagine, and we'll have some visual aid, that you are deep in the forest, a beautiful, dark, coniferous forest at night. There's a full moon somewhere above you in the canopy. Nothing but the sounds of the night around you. And then What you have just heard is a recreation of what it might sound like if you were out and about somewhere and suddenly overheard two dragons engaging in long-range communication. I mentioned that earlier in the video and told you there would be a demonstration, and here it is. This might seem like it would be frightening, but because of the nature of our relationship with our fellow species, there would be no need for fear. This is not a hunting behavior. This is two dragons talking to each other. And now, I wish to talk to you in my species language. I'll be playing for you a series of clips of my own attempts to speak my Draconic language, and I will explain to you what the different words and phrases mean as we go. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoy. So this first word I'd like to start off with, ironically, though it is the shortest of the bunch, it was the hardest one for me to actually get right. It is a very short bark, essentially, and in our language it translates as literally stop. It's usually used as a command. Most commonly you would hear it used with hatchlings who are getting a little too wild and they need to be reined in and brought to order. You will occasionally hear it used if, say, two dragons are getting into a bit of a tiff. An older dragon might remind them that they need to act their age with this word. So if you heard a dragon talk to you that way, you'd know you done messed up. This next word, or rather a phrase, is difficult to translate into English. You could translate it as simply to love or I love you or some variation of that sort of expression, but for us it had a deeper, more complex meaning, and the closest literal translation I've been able to come up with would be something along the lines of, in English, the depths of love, or maybe the depths of kinship. But there's not an easy direct translation into English for this one, but I think that gives you the idea. So this might be used in the context of just about anything. Like I said, it could be used as a sort of I love you expression, which you would hear between lovers, between dear friends, between an elder and the hatchling whom they are raising, from hatchling to hatchling, who have become best friends, much like human children. We had the capacity to become best friends in 5 minutes, and oftentimes those friendships were lifelong. But that's how this phrase would be used, is a sort of an expression of affection. It could also be used in an attempt to explain a relationship. If two dragons were becoming close and others wanted to know, okay, so is this a friendship? Is this a romance? What is this? We want to not tread on any tails here. If you're trying to say that you're taken now, they might use this expression to try to explain what's going on. This next one, I think everybody will relate to. It basically means, if I have to, I guess. It literally means, I go. But it means it in the sort of way of begrudgingly. I go, I do it, but I don't want to. Gosh. This was one of the ones that I discovered completely by accident when I realized that muttering to myself in what I had initially thought was nonsense was, in fact, Draconic speech. So, yeah, I've said this to people unwittingly because I didn't want to do something and I didn't want to say to their faces, I don't want to do that. And so, like any good polyglot, I switched languages. I just didn't realize that's what I had done at the time. It was through meditation that I later realized, oh, that means something. Oopsie. This next word is fairly simple. It just means in past tense to eat or to have eaten. So, pretty straightforward. A dragon would say this to explain that, yes, I have eaten today, or, oh no thank you, I'm full, I've eaten. So this next word quite literally means, well, means, or meaning. It also could be used at the beginning of a sentence to express that this is going to be a lesson or an explanation of sorts. So this last word or phrase is essentially my favorite. If you know me very well at all, you know that I like to refer to myself as this dragon, and that's what this phrase means in my language. So that pretty much wraps up all of my demonstrations of vocalizations of my species language. But don't go away. I'm not done yet. I've still got some more to share with y'all. So now seems like a good time to get into the written language of my species. It was a logographic language, which is substantially different than English, which uses a phonetic alphabet. Instead, we had individual characters for, in the case of our language, specifically for specific concepts more than actual words. And the process of remembering these has been tricky, to say the least. I only have actually recalled long enough to record probably, I think, 7 of these out of I don't know if you want to call it an alphabet, but out of a library of logograms of probably thousands of them. So what you're about to see on the screen represents probably about 4 years worth of meditative effort on my part, and some of them I don't even know what the characters mean. So I'm going to start with those. They're ones that I remembered the shape and I remember the line work, but I can't recall the actual meaning. Some of them I think I might know what the meaning is. Like this one here, it might mean tree, but I feel that that's an incomplete meaning. Meditating on these is not very high on my priority list, to be perfectly honest. But I'm getting there, bit by bit. Like, most recently I discovered the meaning of this particular one here. It essentially means name, or a more literal translation would be something like this dragon. And some of you know I use the word this dragon to describe myself, or to refer to myself rather, quite often. So this one is sort of symbolic of this symbol means a certain individual. And so expounding from that, then I have this logogram, which quite literally means me. This would be pronounced as my Draconic name, which a rough translation of it with human vocal organs, of course, is Dracmanka. So you can see the roots of the simpler logogram, which means basically name, and then expounding from it from there, you get all of this detail, which means me. And then further, we have this logogram, which was one of the first ones I ever discovered. It means flying, to fly, the act of flight. It symbolizes, perhaps it's my bias of having been able to read this language at one time, but to me anyway, it actually looks like the act of flying, the motion of soaring up. But I don't know, that could be because this was my native tongue as a dragon, and that's where I'm getting it from. Then I have this one, which I think a fairly good literal translation of it would be teacher, or possibly mentor, or parent, roles of that nature, someone who would be a guiding, protective figure in the life of a less experienced dragon. And then lastly, this one, I'm not 100% sure on the meaning of it. It has themes of destruction or damage involved. But beyond that, I'm not completely sure what it represents. That's the tricky thing with these logograms, is because they are predominantly representations of ideas, there is no cut and dry literal translation that you can give it. It's more of like, how do you describe the concept of a river? We would have a character for it, a logogram for it. I don't know what that is yet. Unfortunately, they come to me kind of haphazardly. But that's how the language works, is we would have a symbol that means river, and not just like a river, but like the very concept of a river, of flowing water, of the ecosystem that springs up around it, of the fish that live in the river, and the algae that blooms when the river runs low in the summer. All of these concepts together would be all involved in just that one character to evoke that idea. And that's how our written language works, is it's pretty much conceptual in nature. And that's really hard to translate into English, despite English being a really quite large language with a lot of words. You would think it would be easy to come up with this, but you wind up waxing really, really long-winded when you try to describe these things as concepts, and I hope I've done a good job of expressing that. That also does bleed into our spoken language somewhat. I have mentioned before about our telepathy, and that when we are being taught to speak as hatchlings, telepathy is a very big part of how we learn to understand the full meaning of the words that we're being taught to use vocally. Is we're given basically the conceptual idea of the word and its meaning, and then we can use that word to mean this concept in speech. And so our language is very much based on that that method of speaking and communicating through ideas and concepts rather than strings of words to try to equate that. And it worked great for us. It makes it really hard in a human life speaking English, or I think honestly any human language. I don't think there's any language that humans have come up with that's quite like that, at least not that I know of. So that's been one of the hurdles for me in trying to remaster this language, is how do I make this work? How do I make this make sense? And the logographic written language has been one of the biggest hurdles, and obviously I will probably never complete our alphabet because it would be so huge, and it's taken me years to get just a handful of characters dredged up from my memory. Thank you all so much for listening to me talk at you for all of this time. I hope I've made it entertaining and interesting. We are very nearly done with the recorded portion of this presentation. I have one last little treat, I hope, to share with all of you that I've worked very hard on and I'm very proud of. I have mentioned to everybody several times now about how body language was used in my species' language, and I wanted to give a demonstration of how that worked. You may have noticed with the illustrations that I've been using in this presentation so far that I've animated my draconic face with fairly human expressions. And I did that kind of mostly for fun and also because my species didn't make very obvious facial expressions. We made facial expressions, but they were sort of the way a cat makes facial expressions. They're extremely subtle and not as rubber-faced as a human face. And so when you're trying to draw that, it's very, very difficult to bring across those emotions. So I went with human expressions on a dragon face because why not? It's fun. But now I want to demonstrate for you how our actual body language worked and looked. And I'm going to start with one last recording of specifically a greeting in our language. This would be the sort of greeting that a dragon might say to a younger dragon or even a hatchling, almost a good morning. Nice to see you. And I'm going to play it for you in a vacuum first, as I have all of the previous ones. And then I will play it for you again with this body language included. And I will share with you how the meaning deepens with that body language. So, the meaning of that alone essentially means greetings. Now I'm going to play it for you again with body language. With the further context of body language, the meaning of this greeting changes from a simple hello there or greetings to welcome home, little one. You are loved. This greeting in this context would specifically have been used by a mentor dragon or a parent dragon with their hatchling. Now I'm going to play it together for you once more, because that gift does go by fairly quickly. I think it's very special, and I want to share it with you once more. And now we have reached the end of the pre-recorded portion of this panel. I will now come back on live and we can begin our Q&A. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy my answers to your questions. Okie dokie. I hope you all enjoyed that. Ah, I'm so glad. Thank you. Oh, can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, awesome.
And yes, that was super interesting.
I'm very glad, thank you. It's always a worry when you wind up rambling for long stretches if you're boring everybody or not.
Oh, I feel that.
So I know we had a couple questions posted in the panel discussion that I said I would touch on. Do y'all want to come on to the stage to ask them, or do you want me to just read them out for you from the panel discussion chat? Okay, so Seer says he's okay with us just reading it here. Okay, so your question, I know you phrased it a little differently initially, so I'll read both if I can find it again. Very active chat for this panel. Okay, so Cyrenax asked, did the symbol come from study, or was it more so brought through meditation or self-seeking kind of scenario? And then he also reiterated, how were you able to see the symbol that represents Dracmanka? So, to answer the first part of that, it was pretty much meditation. When I realized that, or rather when I recalled that my species had a writing system that was distinctly our own, then I got to thinking, okay, so what was it? And why doesn't it just come automatically to me like our spoken language seems to do? And so I spent a lot of fruitless attempts meditating before I finally came across one night laying in bed trying not to fall asleep while meditating. I had a recollection of learning to write the language as a hatchling. And so once I actually had this visual memory of, we actually used our wing claw, the thumb claw in our wing, sort of like a dip pen. And that was how we learned to write. And eventually, as we got older, we would learn to use telekinesis and an actual pen. But they started us with a physical limb because it's a little easier and a little less messy. And so I had this memory of kind of like in schools for humans, actually, how you sit down at a desk and the teacher will write on a board, you know, the uppercase letter and the lowercase version of that letter for the day, and then you're supposed to write the letters over and over to get a feel for them. It was kind of like that you would just write characters over and over until you got the feel for it, and then you would get another letter or another character. In our case, I suppose, a logogram. And unfortunately, though it was a very clear memory during my meditation session, when I came out of it, I was left with just this sort of vague feeling that I had been writing letters, and I couldn't remember the actual shapes anymore of, like, individual letters. But with further meditation, I eventually was able to start to recall specific shapes. And because of that first memory that I received, I was able to determine if it was my imagination playing tricks on me, or if it was legitimate. And so that kind of leads us to your second half of your question, Seer, of how was I able to see the symbol that represents my name, Dracmanka. And that one was kind of a little bit backwards from how I had it in the presentation. Was I remembered the logogram for me, for Dracmanka, before I remembered the logogram that just meant name. And then sometime later, in fact quite recently, about a month ago, I realized the character that meant name. And I think I mostly remembered it because I was the one who created it. And it was one of the early ones that I remembered. I think it was the third logogram that I remembered. And essentially because the logogram for name is part of it, and that's how all of our names are written. We start with that character as the base, and then as an individual preference, we add kind of artistically, I suppose, but in the style of our alphabet, we add to it, and that then becomes our name. So I think because I actually created it myself, that's why it came to me fairly easily during a meditation session. I wasn't specifically trying to dredge that up. I was just trying to remember Brain, give me a character. Give me a logogram. I don't care what it is and I don't care what it means. Just give me something, please. And when I recalled it and wrote it down, it was after I wrote it down that I actually drew it out that I realized what it meant. And that's how most of them have been for me, is I don't remember the meaning until I've actually drawn it. Something about the act of drawing it that brings back the memory, if anything's going to. So I hope that is a satisfactory answer for you, Seer. And I know there was another one by Wonderlight. How do you meditate on your true self? I don't know, Wonderlight, did you want to come up and ask the question vocally, or are you cool with me just having read it out? Okay. So the question was, how do you meditate on your true self? Or how do you, how do you get memories of your past? And that's, I don't want to say like what I do and then say that that's how you should do it, because everybody's experiences are going to be a little different. But for me, what seems to work best is, especially if I put on some music that makes me feel dragony, and then I'll get into a meditative position. Sometimes I like to lay in my bed, or even on the floor sometimes, or sitting down in a chair and being in a cleared space with no distractions. And I'll start by just imagining myself as a dragon, getting my mind into this dragon mode, seeing myself in my head as my dragon self, imagining that my hands are my paws, letting myself visualize what I normally only feel as phantom wings as my actual wings, feeling my scales where I currently have skin. And when I've gotten into this mode of imagining and being able to feel myself as a dragon, then I'll try to imagine myself back home. And I'll try to let my mind just do its thing. And sometimes I'll get some pretty wild stuff that doesn't work. Like, I had a very early one of these where I wound up in a completely fictional place that was not my home, but I was binging that media at the time, and so I wound up just, well, okay, I guess I'm here now, this is fine, this is cool. And so even when you don't actually get into your past life, sometimes it can still help you to just connect with your dragon self. But if you're patient, eventually you will get lucky enough, at least I have. I should hope that it will work for you. I hope I'm not sending you off on a wild goose chase. That if you think about, I want to be myself and I want to be home, that if you're lucky and your brain's cooperative, that you can sometimes dredge up these memories and, at least in my case, relive them. And so far, I have managed to recall, like I mentioned in answer to Sear's question, the memory of learning to write my language. I've also been able to recall my first time ever flying. And the more of these that you are able to dredge up and are able to confirm to yourself over time that, yes, this is a real memory, this is not something that my imagination has created out of wishful thinking. And sometimes even the things that your imagination creates out of wishful thinking have grains of truth in them. So don't discard those out of hand. There might be something to it. You can slowly piece together this patchwork of a dragon life, and the more of it you have, the more little details kind of filter into the cracks and cement themselves into place with the larger memories. And that's kind of what laid the groundwork for me to be able to recall my language at all, was the sudden realization that this fit into my memories that I already had. And so it's sort of a snowball effect. You get one, and then you can build from there. The tricky part is getting one. I think I've rambled enough. Does that help at all, or is that just a bunch of word soup?
I understood what you meant, no worries.
Oh, good. Good. I'm glad, Wonderlight. I'm glad it helps. So those were the two questions that I saw during the presentation. Was there any others that I missed, or the chat was kind of going a mile a minute, and I might have missed something in there while I was talking? So if anybody else has questions, if you could pop them in for me so that I don't lose anything. I don't want to ignore anybody unwittingly. Oh yes, Starflight asked about the reading direction. So it's read much like English, actually, left to right and top to bottom. You start in the left upper hand corner. And sort of like some other logographic languages, like I think there's a Japanese character set, or maybe it's Chinese, that works the same way, where individual character is a word. And so you would read it, a character meaning a word, and then contextually, like in English, where context can sometimes change the meaning of a sentence depending on the way you organize the words. So you can't just toss them out willy-nilly. They have to be read in the correct order, and they have to be written in the correct order. But yeah, the reading direction is the same as English, left to right, top to bottom. That's a lot of words to say that. Oh yeah, I can send the raw video to whoever's going to be compiling these. Is that Akir who's going to be doing that? Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, we can talk about it more after the panel. And I see that we are at 3:00, and this panel was supposed to run from 2 to 3. Do we need to wrap it up? I don't want to tread on anybody else's panel.
Our next panel is in 30 minutes, so you can probably say a few more words if you wanted to.
Okay. I pretty much I tried to cram everything into the pre-recorded section, but I wanted to have some time afterwards for questions if folks had more questions. But if not, that was pretty much everything I had to say on the topic, and we could wrap up now.
Understandable. Thank you for hosting this. Thank you for hosting this panel, Drac. It was super interesting.
I'm so glad y'all liked it. I took a great deal of pleasure from putting this together for everybody, and my main concern was if it would be boring. So I'm glad that it wasn't boring.
Yeah, not at all.
Okay, now I have to go through the chat and give heart reacts to all of these thank you responses and praise and everything. Y'all are too kind.
Understandable. Did you have anything else to say before the stage ends?
Just another thank you for everybody for coming and listening and enjoying.
Thank you.
And thank you for hosting the summit, Lunath.
Of course, I'm always happy to.